Thank you, Dr. Carrier. My good friend Steven says, if the Qumran sect considered Daniel to be authoritative, making at least 8 copies, did they have no way to determine that it was a recent forgery?
Well, to an extent, no. Like, how would you without modern forensic methods? In ancient times, generally the only method you see for people just determining something as a forgery is stylistic analysis. And they had a primitive form of stylistic analysis. We have much more advanced computational stylistic analysis now, but they had a primitive form of it a classic example is Hippocrates. Tons of Hippocratic literature was forged, and this is a big problem in the medical community. They were really annoyed by this. Well, some defended it as no big deal, but others saw it as a serious problem. And the way they would tell is if they would pick what was the most reliable, like the earliest attested Hippocratic texts, and they have a consistent style. So you say, well, okay, this is clearly written by one author. The best bet it is Hippocrates because it clearly comes from that time. And then they would find forgeries that are written in a different style, and they say, well, this is clearly not written by that guy, so this is therefore a forgery. So that was the way they did it. Now, you couldn't do this with Daniel because there's no previous Danielic literature. And ironically, even if you had the first 6 chapters still floating around, they're in a different language than the next 6 chapters, right? So the stylistic analysis is kind of blocked there, right? You can't really do stylistic analysis from Hebrew to Aramaic, or at least you could today, but back then they didn't have the skills or knowledge for how to do that effectively. But method is a separate question. Would they even want to? That's the more important question. I don't think they would have any interest at all in testing whether it was a forgery. And this is the big problem you have with apologetics throughout history, from even the most ancient of times all the way up to now, is that, and I've been talking about this last month, a lot of my articles are about this, is the idea that apologetics is actually specifically designed to avoid discovering the truth about things. It's designed to specifically justify things you want to believe. So it's clear that the Qumran community wanted to believe that Daniel was an authentic scripture, so they would never have bothered. They would never have dared test whether it was a forgery. If they would do anything about it, they would write treatises, apologetic treatises, defending it as authentic, right? Against anyone who would accuse it as being a forgery. But there wouldn't have been anyone accusing it of it being a forgery who wasn't on the other side of the Civil War, in other words, the losing side of the Civil War. So no one's going to be listening to them if they're even alive at this point, right? So, so they're just, we don't have newspapers. We don't have letters to the editor of this battle over the authenticity of Daniel at the time of the publication. We don't get to hear the conversations. We don't get to hear what people
in light of the fact that it's trying to give an optimistic look for their people. It's like me and you hearing really good news about us in a very bad situation, and we're gonna, you know what, this is a fake news. Like, you want to believe it.
It's right? it's more like the fake news that comes out of OAN or Fox now, right? Like people just believe it like gospel, even though it's actually a lot of it's bogus, because they want to believe it. It's important for them that it be true. And Daniel was a crucial text legitimizing the Maccabean and Hasmonean reign. So the Jewish elite, priesthood and political elite, definitely backed its authenticity because they needed to. Their legitimacy rested on it being an authentic document. So it had the full backing of the elite. Including the most, would have had the backing of the most prestigious priests and so on. So yeah, it would be very unlikely to find a sect who was still around after that war that would be against the authenticity of Daniel. So the question is about the Dead Sea Scroll sect. Like, clearly they bought this as authentic, and they would have had no interest in trying to find out if it wasn't. Like, it would not have even occurred to them as a thing to admit to or look into.
I think this is so interesting. Real quick, Dragons in Genesis is asking, you have any recommendation on books and articles to help us understand Daniel? Something
yes. I cite many, in fact, the best ones in my article itself, and with links sometimes. So right early on, I talk about which commentaries are the best ones. The Hermeneia commentary, I think, is a really good one if you can get a hold of it. I think the Hermeneia commentaries tend to be expensive. But when public libraries open up again, you can usually get them through interlibrary loan if they don't already have a Hermeneia set. And I recommend to people, like, if you just in general, like, there are often, if you find a seminary that you can get to, now pandemic may have changed everything, but normally and possibly in future when things return to normal. Seminaries often have open libraries. Like anybody can come in and use their library. You can't check things out necessarily. They're research libraries, so you have to leave things there. But I used seminaries all over the country to do work on this. So like they'll have all the commentaries, right? Both bogus and the best, right? So all kinds of stuff. So good journal collections in religious studies and in Christian apologetics and so on. So seminaries are a thing to look at. See if there is a library in a seminary near you that is open to the public. If you want to do this kind of looking up things, like if you want to check the best commentaries on the Bible, and those commentaries cost $100-200 if you're going to buy them. But if you want to just go peruse them, there might be a seminary around that has them. But even if not, your local public library can interlibrary loan it for you from anywhere in the world. So that's what I recommend to people who want to dive into this, unless you're going to bankroll it, like you go buy the books, if you're that interested. But anyways, yeah, so best articles, best books, they're listed throughout my article on my website. So that's the best place to go. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the super chat. Dragons and Genesis, go subscribe. Check it out, ladies and gentlemen. I need to ask you this one here. Maybe you could spend a little time giving us the detail. You do this in your article, and I know that this is just kind of recapping in a way, but there's also things you're going to mention that you don't say in your article, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course.
You talk about the Sal trap. I hope I'm saying that right. Sal trap. That King Cyrus
satraps. Yeah, the satraps.
Okay, explain what that is, because when I read that, I don't even know.
It's a Persian term, so it doesn't correspond to any English word.
Can you tell me what that is and what the problem is with the whole Darius the Great, Cyrus the Great, who made it?
So a satrap means governor, in the way that the Romans, they would assign proconsuls as governors of provinces. And we today would use the word governor. So we'd say that so-and-so is the governor of Syria, or so-and-so is the governor of Spain under the Romans. The Persian word is satrap, but it just means governor, basically. It's someone that you appoint to run a province. So that's all it means. And the question about the satrapies, the provinces, is how many there were and who created them. In historical reality, Cyrus the Great, who actually was the Persian conqueror who set this whole system up, he started the idea of satrapies and satraps. Darius the Great, who was several successions later, he was not the successor to Cyrus, but there was a few other kings in between, but eventually then Darius the Great took over. And then he did an important reorganization of the satrapies that made the history books with some confusion as to the details. And so the author of Daniel just point blank says Darius created the satrapies, which is not an entirely accurate way to put it. And also it incorrectly states the number of satrapies. It says 120 of them, but there were not even more than 24, really. So it gets the number of satrapies wrong. It gets wrong the exact history of how they were developed and who made them and so on. But it makes sense for someone to confuse these things, and confusing Darius the Great with the important thing is Darius the Great did do an important reorganization of this. So his name was associated with this development. So when Daniel says Darius the Mede did this, that's the clue that they have mistaken Darius the Great for Darius the Mede, which is there's no such thing as Darius the Mede. It's a fictional character. They've got confused, I think possibly on purpose, because there's a prophecy about how the Medes would conquer Babylon, and that didn't happen. It was the Persians. So I think whoever's authoring Daniel might have deliberately made Daniel a Mede and argued for him being a Mede in order to also satisfy the prophecy, right? It's kind of like inventing history to satisfy the prophecy. It's like inventing the nativity to make Jesus fit prophecies of the birth of Messiah, right? Like it's all fake history, but it's not real history, but it's designed to satisfy prophecy. It's possible that Darius the Mede was invented as a character for that, and it's based on Darius the Great. So they've conflated different rulers, and they've basically made Darius the Great into Darius the Mede, and then changed when he reigned, and then changed the exact details of what he did, and in order to fit their narrative of what they wanted to sell. Some of that might have been just historical error. Some of it might have been deliberate.
I think in your apologetics section of the article, you mentioned something about the Canon being closed potentially in the 5th century BC, and that this would be the reason why someone who's writing this might try to push us back into the 6th century and act like, no, this this is before everything was like closed.
It's important to get that distinction correct. The idea of closing the canon did not occur in the 5th century BC. It occurred probably right around the time that Daniel is, or possibly a century before when Daniel was forged. So we're talking like 3rd century BC, maybe. The idea started arising in the 3rd, maybe 2nd century BC. The idea started arising that anything written after the 5th century couldn't be scripture. It could only be man-made human stuff. And so the idea, that's hundreds of years later. And so they kind of like blocked the canon then, right? And they said anything after 5th century, we're not going to count as scripture. Now, there was no official decision. This wasn't like something someone just said. Right. It was just a general sense of like this idea. Eventually it coalesces a few more centuries later into an actual doctrine. But that was like after even the Second Jewish War, like the Roman Jewish War. But the idea was floating around the time of Daniel. So the idea was there that anything that claimed to have been written after the 5th century would be suspect, right? So so in that atmosphere, yes, of course, you're going to create a document that purports to be written in the 6th century or 5th century to be conveniently meet the deadline. So yeah, that there is a causal explanation there that fits, and so I think that makes sense of it.
So you're telling me Daniel did not predict the Roman-Jewish War? How the heck did he not do that?
Yeah, I know apologists want this to be the case, but you really have to twist the original context and to get it to fit that way, basically.
So, I mean, this is a valid point because you mentioned Onias III. I believe I saw Jim Major's comment that there were 2 priests mentioned in, was it Daniel 9 where this is mentioned, or 11, or?
Well, anointed, let's be clear.
Anointed.
Yeah. So it using the language of prophecy, which is always deliberately vague, so you can match more things. It sounds like prophecy if you're not hyper specific, right? So they try to use these vague terms like, the prince and the anointed, and like, what do you mean exactly? And it's like, well, you know what we mean, but so that sounds more authentic as prophecy if you use these vague terms. So anointed, like priests were considered anointed, so they were Christ's in that sense because they were priests and kings were often considered anointed people. So that was a legitimate way to refer to a priest, and to call the principal anointed, that is just sort of like prophecy speak for chief priest, high priest, right? So yeah, that's going on there. But in the mathematics in Daniel 9,
that's what I was going to ask you to get into.
It refers to 2 anointed figures, and so it kind of links them with 2 different overlapping periods of time. One is a 49-year period of time. One is a 434-year period of time. And why they're doing this, you got to read my article to understand why they're trying to make the Jeremiah prophecy work. All this legerdemain they had to do to get it to work, to make it sound impressive, and so on. And in fact, this shows that they're writing for this period. Like they're writing for the Seleucid period because they tried so convolutedly hard to get this Jeremiah prophecy and to explode out all this complicated math to try and get it to fit Onias. And it does exactly fit Onias, right? But there's 2 periods. The one is the 434 years, which fits Onias. And then the other is the 49-year period. And so there's still dispute in the commentaries as to which anointed that one refers to, right? And in my opinion, the math works out. The exact 49-year period works out for Cyrus the Great. And we know Cyrus the Great was considered an anointed. He was considered the Messiah because he rescued the Jews, basically. He restored the temple and so on. So they actually gave him sort of honorary messianic status. And we know this is in the Bible, right? It actually says this, right? So I think the first anointed is meant to be Cyrus. So it's the 49-year period between, I can't remember the final exile, the final event that exiled the Jews, which is 484 or whatever, in the 480s, when they were finally pulled out of Jerusalem and brought out of Israel, and in the exile. And 49 years later, Cyrus the Great comes in and conquers and issues his decree that it releases the Jews and returns them to their home and rebuilds their temple. And that 49-year period lines up with Cyrus the Great. So I think the first anointed, the authors intended to be a reference to Cyrus, and then the second one is to Onias. And the convoluted ways that works out is you have to read my article and then the commentaries that I'm basing it on. So.
Yeah, your article really deals with this issue bad. And I wanted to ask about this time gap that I think is important when people try to stretch us to the New Testament real quick. But Aryan, my friend, actually has a super chat. I appreciate the super chat, brother. how do fundamentalist Christian scholars deal with the historical 2nd century BC mistakes? Now, in your article, you mentioned some of this.
Oh yeah, the whole article is designed to address exactly what you're talking about, what Arjun is talking about, which is, yes, obviously they have elaborate just so stories to explain away all of this evidence, right? And to make it be an authentic text. And so I go into what those arguments are, and not only do I show that why they're wrong, but I go into the general principle behind even making these arguments is illustrative of apologetics as a methodology. And so I go into like how this differs from history as a methodology. And so I use these as teaching examples of that. But I go into all of the main arguments that they try to pull. I mean, there's a variety. There's a whole ton of them. Like trying to get Darius the Mede to be someone else, right? For like they find another actual historical figure and say, well, that was Darius the Mede, and Daniel's talking about that guy. And like it doesn't really fit, doesn't really work. But it's what they try. And there's other things like they say, like really Nabonidus. Am I saying that right? I don't Babylonian here. I don't speak Babylonian, but Nabonidus was the father of Belshazzar. Belshazzar was just the regent for the actual king of Nabonidus. And so Daniel, the author of Daniel, doesn't know about Nabonidus, and he thinks Belshazzar was the king, and he also thinks Belshazzar was the son of someone else. Like gets these details wrong, and so fundamentalists will go in and try to come up with just so stories such that this could still be true, right? Like, so there's various excuses and ways that they try to get it to go and work out that way. And so if you want to see what those arguments are, and I even link to some of them, so you can actually go read the original apologetics themselves and not just take my word for it in my article. So you can go through detail by detail if you're interested in those things. But what I show in there is that none of them are historical logic. Like at no point do they actually argue like a historian. They're trying to rationalize a preconceived conclusion. And then coming up with just so stories to explain all the evidence without presenting any evidence that those just so stories are true or even probable. And that's the difference between apologetics and history. And that's I use the article to explain. I think it's useful for people to like see that distinction so you can start seeing it in other arguments and other places for other things.